Thank you everyone for coming to this second talk. And I'm Tung, the Associate Dean for the School of Political Science and Economics here at TU. And before I properly introduce Jake, and I also want to mention that the event is sponsored by the School of Political Science and Economics, and we actually have a title for this talk, which is the Sinopac Financial Distinguished Lecture. So I do want Jake and everyone to know this. So it's, of course, a great honor of ours to have Professor Shapiro to be a speaker here for this particular talk. And so Professor Shapiro is a professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University. And especially given the context of the conference we are having here, so Jake is also a co-founder of the Empirical Studies of Conflict project, which we call ESOC. And which is actually the reason why we are here, together with the conference we're going to have tomorrow. And so this is a multi-university consortium that studies politically motivated violence in countries around the world. And Professor Shapiro has, of course, published extensively on conflicts, economic developments, and security in a wide range of peer-reviewed articles, as well as, very impressively, 100 policy articles and book chapters. And he is a recipient of 2016 Karl Deutsch Award from the International Study Association. And this is an award given to scholars younger than 40 years old or 10 years of earning a PhD, and who has made the major significant contribution to the study of international relations. So I guess without further ado, so Jake is going to talk to us about this very interesting topic, using data to understand conflict, lessons from 20 years of research. And I guess Jake will probably spend maybe 30 to 40 minutes for his talk, and then we open up for Q&A. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Awesome, thank you. So what I want to do today is share a little bit of some different research, but in the service of identifying some general lessons that I and the research community that Hans described have learned over the last 20 years about how to use data to study conflict. And I'd like to think about this as a complement to this morning's talk that Jim gave, in the sense that he talked a lot about kind of the current conflict or potential conflict in Asia Pacific and some of the policy issues around it. But if you want to do research on the underlying dynamics of these kinds of conflicts, what are some principles you can use? So what I'm going to talk about is I'm first going to give some context for the talk. What's the body of evidence and the body of things that we've studied? Then I'll talk about two different research projects which help me highlight basically three principles that I'm going to focus on. And to give the bottom line up front, the three principles are repurpose, 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 because almost all the data behind the studies I'm going to talk about was collected originally for a very different purpose, but we're able to find ways to apply it to research on conflict. And that's often going to be the case. The second is that field work and subject matter knowledge is a complement to data, not a substitute for it. Oftentimes in political science, particularly in the US, we had this divide between people who got deep on conflicts and people who would then work with the data. And in our experience, that was not at all the case. Almost always, the good theory and the good data came from being out in the field engaging with people. And then the third principle I'll talk about is that oftentimes the things that you can measure and study with data are intermediate outcomes that only get you to the thing you really want to study through some theoretical construct. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that at the end. So that's the agenda for what we're going to do. So we started this work back in 2009 in this context where what this shows you is from 1975 through 2005. The number of new military interventions overseas the US is engaging in each year, and the total number ongoing here on the right. And what you can see from this is we're entering into this work in a period where the US is engaging regularly overseas, and most of those engagements are not turning out well, which is why they start accumulating. And so there's something to understand about how to operate effectively in these conflicts. So what we did as a research community is we went out and we started looking at all the countries around the world where we thought we could get both high-resolution data on conflict, so we could begin to apply tools from economics and political economy and statistics to understand how different policies were working in these places, And also we wanted to make sure that as we began to accumulate evidence across all these different conflicts, that it was adding up to something that wasn't specific to one particular place. So we can talk more about the concept of external validity, but oftentimes what we could learn with great precision, say from studying the politics of kind of clan violence and competition over aid in Somalia, was not unique to that place. We could learn what elements of it were general across multiple places. So this, as we started to get into this and we started to do this work, a couple things became apparent right away. So the first thing is this principle. Many times, the things that government organizations thought would work didn't. This is my favorite example. So what this plot shows you is for districts of Afghanistan that did or did not receive something called the Local Governance and Community Development Program, the trends in violence. So what was LGCD? This was a program that USAID administered in Afghanistan, about $500 million worth of aid programming, that was designed explicitly to connect local communities with the national government. And the idea was that connecting local communities to the national government would reduce the influence of the Taliban and encourage peace and stability. So now, I'm going to step back and look at the plot. And I don't know if you notice what I notice, but the LGDC districts are in black, and the other districts are in gray. And it clearly, before the program starts in 2006, there is a small difference between those districts. And in every fighting season after that, the districts where the US government was spending, again, $500 million in aid were more violent per capita than the districts that weren't. And that difference gets larger every fighting season. So whatever you think about this, you have to believe the counterfactual was that these places in black would get much, much worse to think the program was working. And that's a reasonable argument to say, but this reflects a general pattern, which is many programs that certainly the US and other countries were applying in irregular conflicts around the world during this period didn't work in the way we expected to. So that was motivating lesson number one. Motivating lesson number two is that national conflicts are not national conflicts. So what this plot shows you is on the left for Afghanistan and on the right for Iraq. It shows you the monthly number of combat incidents per capita recorded by, in this case, the US government and its allies for the 24 most violent districts in each country. So a couple things to note. First, in both countries, that set of 24 most violent districts accounts for between 80 and 90% of all combat during this period. So in Afghanistan, this represents about 5% of the districts in the country. And in Iraq, about 20%. So really, the violence is concentrated in a few places. And then if you look more at these, you'll notice the trends are very different in different places. So Afghanistan, you have this clear seasonality that you don't have in Iraq. It's because it's in the mountains. It gets too cold to fight in most parts of the country during the winter time. But also where violence peaks is at different times. Some parts of Iraq, violence peaks in 2005, some 2006, some 2007. So what appeared to be a national conflict was in fact a series of highly localized conflicts. Now, for us as social scientists, that's great because it means there's variation to explain. And so just a couple quick proofs of the impact, and then we'll get into the principles that we learned in this endeavor. So the first proof of impact is that if you look at the count of papers published in the top 5 journals in economics, or the top 3 in political science, from 2009 to the present, that use subnational data on conflict, that use this kind of data as either the outcome or the treatment variable, it's gone up massively over time. Right? This is a style of research that was very fringe in both political science and economics in 2009 and is mainstream now. Second thing is this just shows citation counts for papers supported directly by the ESOC network. And the numbers are lower if we drop out like Renard from this list. He's sitting right back there. But you know, we've had a significant impact on the field. Several thousand citations every year now to research from this community. Okay, so now the fun part of the talk. So repurpose, repurpose, repurpose. So what I want to do is I want to start here with an example from research on terrorism. And the story here goes back to 1998 and the East Africa embassy bombings, after which the US government, so 1998, to remind everyone, Al-Qaeda attacks 2 US embassies in East Africa, kills thousands of people. And after these, the US government starts working around the world to target different Islamist terrorist organizations. And it begins taking all of the documents that is collecting in the course of these operations and putting them into a database. So these are like letters between different fighters, expense reports, things like that. The purpose of this database is targeting. You want to be able to use it to identify connections between people, to figure out where they might live. It's not like a research database. And, but there's this question, right, which is like how, especially in 2005, like how capable are groups like Al-Qaeda? And if you started to look at what they were doing from the perspective of organization theory and behavioral economics, what you would quickly come to is that these groups had a real problem. You have to use violence in very specific ways to accomplish political goals. You need to delegate to do that. You need to hire people because the boss can't do it all themselves. If you're going to delegate to people, well, they don't always want to do things the way you want to. And so how do you control them? Well, you control them with paperwork, but that increases risk. So this is the dilemma terrorist groups faced. Or at least in theory, this is the dilemma terrorist groups faced. So how would you know that? Well, you'd want to understand, are you seeing the following things within groups? Are you seeing disagreements over what to target, over where to do violence? Are you seeing disagreements over how to spend money? And in particular, are you seeing those disagreements because of some of these reasons? You have, for example, the kinds of people who want to be out there in front, in the vanguard, doing terrorist attacks. They tend to be action-oriented people, not people who think deeply politically. So they typically want to do more violence than would be politically optimal. They're operating covertly. They're trying to stay secure. So they get different information about the world, about local politics than the bosses. And if you're selecting people on expertise, for example, for moving money, the people who tend to have expertise in moving money covertly and in generating in conflict-affected places, they tend to be criminals and not people who are deeply committed to some religious purpose. So then the question is, we have this data set that's collected for targeting purposes. Could we use it to look for evidence of these kinds of dynamics that we would expect from organizational economics? And the answer is yes. So let me start with disagreement over tactics. So in early 2006, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, then the dominant Islamist insurgent organization in Iraq, kills Sheikh Nasser al-Fadawi in the town of Ramadi in western Iraq. And this is a political disaster for the group. Fadawi is politically popular. This is often cited as the start of the Anbar Awakening, which is the point that the insurgency in Iraq turns against the insurgency. And so the leadership of Al-Qaeda in Iraq writes to the cell in Ramadi and says, hey guys, you have used too much violence here. You've killed someone that you shouldn't have killed. It's a political disaster, and we need you to stop. And now there's some gruesome details as to how they killed Fadawi that I won't go into, but they're basically saying you violated what people will tolerate. The response from the people in Ramadi is to say, okay, got it, we won't do that again. But by the way, every time that you senior leaders, every time one of you gets killed in a US strike, we get different rules. So can we please have some written standard operating procedures? Now, for anyone who's had a boss that's kind of like flighty and changes their mind all the time, like you've probably asked for like, hey boss, can you write down the rules so like it's consistent for me? The thing is, for this group, writing this down means you have to distribute it. And you have to distribute it either electronically or in paper to people. And all of those actions create opportunities for the US and Iraqi government to get out and find you. And so if this kind of thing is happening generally, that means that the terrorist groups against a competent government are self-contained, and therefore the policy question for the US of how serious is this threat suggests that it may not be as bad as we thought. So it's not just about how to use violence. This is Ayman al-Zawahiri, al-Qaeda's second in command. He was apparently a notorious micromanager. And so this is from a letter that he sent in 1999 to a cell in Yemen about their expense reporting and the deficiencies in it. This particular letter wasn't actually from the Harmony database. This was found on his laptop after the fall of Kabul because a Wall Street Journal reporter happened to purchase his laptop and was able to download everything from it before he was bought. But basically, he goes on for 11 points, I just show you the first one here, about how this organization's expense reporting was insufficient. The leader of this cell responds by saying, if you're going to be this much of a micromanager, I don't want to be in al-Qaeda anymore, and leaves. This is not unique. This is Abu Hafs al-Masri here, often called al-Qaeda's military leader, in February 1999, writing to this gentleman here, Abu Kabab, and basically saying, you haven't filed the appropriate forms for reimbursement of your travel expenses. He goes on in a second letter, also in this database, this is from the Harmony data, to say you bought air conditioners for the tents at your training camps, that wasn't approved, none of the rest of us have air conditioners, we need you to return the money to the Treasury. So again, this is totally normal organizational stuff, but the fact that it is happening helps us put the threat from this class of organizations into perspective. And we're doing it with data that was not collected for us to be able to do organizational economics on terrorist groups. It was collected for targeting purposes, but we could repurpose it to other uses. So this is qualitative data. I'm going to skip over that for the moment. And let's talk about some quantitative data and field work. So why are these things complements? And what I want to do here is start, I'm going to actually tell you a bit of a story. So this story is about what the dynamics of an insurgency are at the tactical level, where you have a very powerful counterinsurgent force, could be a competent local state, could be a local state and its foreign allies. And in those settings, the critical kind of dynamic is information for the reasons I'll explain. Okay, so imagine for yourself, there's going to be some quotes on these slides. I'm not going to read them. These are from people who are involved in the insurgency in the Philippines. But imagine one night in the Philippines, in the southern Philippines, where there's been an insurgency basically since the Spanish showed up in the 1500s. There's a father. And he lives in a house that's along a lane like this one. And at about midnight one night, he hears some rustling in the alley behind his house. Now, it's late. There's not supposed to be anyone out there. And so he knows that it's probably the insurgents coming to set an IED to target the patrol that comes down the alley every morning. Now, the father has a difficult decision here, because if the IED goes off and the patrol is ambushed, that's going to put his family at risk. But if he shares information, if he calls this in, that puts him at risk as well. So what does he do? Now, he stays up and he is thinking about this, and he's considering and considering and considering. And he has a couple things that he thinks about. One is, he doesn't really like the government, right? They haven't treated people that well. The soldiers don't always treat the local population that well. He'd really like to have a Muslim governor if he could, and not have the Christians from Luzon coming in and bossing everyone around. So maybe he should stay quiet and let the IED attack happen. On the other hand, earlier in the month, some government soldiers escorted aid workers in, and they brought some desks to his children's school. So now his daughters don't have to sit on the ground when they're taking their lessons. They can sit at a desk and take notes, and he would like more of that. And he knows that if the attack goes off, then it's going to be harder to get goods in. And so again, his choice is not clear. On the one hand, the government provides some value. On the other hand, he doesn't like them politically. So it's now 4 in the morning, and the father has, maybe an hour to decide before the patrol is going to come down the alley. And he's thinking he doesn't know what to do because look, if that IED goes off and then there's a firefight and it happens when his wife is cooking breakfast for their children, their stove is by the window and she would be exposed. On the other hand, if he calls in the tip and he's seen these tip lines advertised for the government around town, maybe one of his neighbors who supports the insurgency will overhear him, and then the rebels will come for him and his daughters will be orphaned. And so that's also a risk. And so he doesn't know what to do. And so this story that I've told you, based on field work that my co-author on this work, Joe Felter, did for many years. He served in the US military in the Philippines for many years and talked with many of the people I've quoted here who were participants in this conflict about it, gives you a dynamic where what happens in this kind of fight, and this gentleman, Vic Corpus, is one of the people who fought it, is basically you have these 3 actors that are involved. You have the civilians, who we talked about a lot, who are deciding to share information. You have the rebels, who can do some things to them. They can provide services, they cause externalities, they can take taxes, and then you have a government that provides services and extracts information. And if you model this out game theoretically, what you get is you get a dynamic like this. So remember that example I told you from Al-Qaeda in Iraq before? So they asked for some standard operating procedures, and this is Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was the leader of that group, basically writes back and said, look, you're doing too much violence, you need to stop, come see us and let's have a conversation about that. What he is describing is the equilibrium solution to that 3-party game I gave you before, which is that the rebels will create just enough risk for the population that they're indifferent, that the father is indifferent between sharing information or not. Because if they create too many externalities, he calls in the tip, and the patrol knows there's an IED, they can defuse it, and then maybe they can track down the people who set it. But if he doesn't call in the tip, then there's a firefight and there's some externalities. So the rebels want to stay just below that threshold. And that's what you see in those internal documents. Now what we can do is we can take this to data in Iraq, because we had in Afghanistan as well, because in these different conflicts, and also in India and Pakistan and Colombia and Mexico and Kenya so far, to name a few, what we have is we have data on combat, and then we have data on the other variables in the story I told you, in the goods and services that are provided to people in the village, and in the ability to share information. So I'll show you results from providing goods and services to people. So in that story I told you, remember, the father cares about small-scale spending, right? He cares about small things that are done for the people in his village. So what these plots show you is an example of some of the kind of work we are able to do. On the y-axis is the change month to month in combat incidents per 1,000 people for each district of Iraq for a 6-month period. And on the x-axis, in this plot, is changes in something called the Commander's Emergency Response Program, which is small-scale spending distributed with military forces to support local public goods like the chairs and desks in the classroom. This is all other spending by USAID. So this is big projects by USAID in Iraq, things like water treatment plants, roads, projects that are designed to increase employment. And then this shows you all large-scale spending, including like military construction and things like that. And then what I've done is I've separated out in black the periods when there was a boost of expertise in how you execute development versus the other months. So generally, the small-scale spending reduces violence, and more so in periods when they get an increase in local expertise. That is not true for large-scale spending of any kind. So that is consistent with the argument that I just told you, which is what happens is in months when the US government comes in and is able to provide a little bit more local public goods in Iraq, The rebels then say, okay, we have to rein in our activities because otherwise the fathers are going to start calling in the tips and we're going to get targeted. Another implication of the story that I told you is that if there are more forces present in an area to go out and hunt down the two guys who were setting the ID behind the father's house, then this kind of spending should be more effective. And so what this next figure shows you is, and this is something that's been found in other places, as you increase the number of units that are present in a given district to take advantage of information, the marginal effect of the spending becomes larger. So the violence reducing effect of aid spending is larger in periods where you have more forces to take advantage of it than in ones where you don't. And I want to highlight this last one, CSP. That's something called the Community Stabilization Program. That's another example of where expertise in how you do this matters. That's a USAID-run program for small projects in Iraq that was designed to work very closely with the military. So it's exactly that story I told you. When you can do a better job of selecting the kinds of projects the father would care about, the violence-reducing effect is larger. And to give you a sense of the magnitude of the effects, in a place with kind of the median number of maneuver battalions present over a 6-month period, it's about $100,000 in aid spending to get one last combat incident in Iraq. So not a huge effect, but meaningful. So last thing, you can't always measure what you want. So the goal for US forces in Afghanistan and Iraq, or the goal of the Mexican police in Mexico, or the goal of the different Indian counterinsurgency forces in the states affected by the Naxalites, or the Pakistani army in the federally administered tribal areas, was not to reduce violence in a given village or a valley. It was to get a strategic outcome. But those strategic outcomes happen once in each place, and we have lots of variance in what's going on, so we can't directly measure that. And the thing that we learned in this work is basically right here. There's an algorithm for winning a given village or a valley, and it is something that is consistent with what any experienced US Special Forces operator would have told you in 2005, which is you earn a little bit of local goodwill, you get some information on who the insurgents are, you run operations to get them, you collect more information, and you iterate and repeat that cycle until you've reduced the ability of the insurgency to operate in a given area. So we kind of showed that with data. The second thing is in many of these places, there were very inexpensive actions that had significant consequences on violence. In some ways, my favorite of these is the installation of cellular communications. In Iraq, for example, you could put up a new cell tower that created original coverage over an area in 2005, 6, 7, 8 for about $250,000. That would reduce by 50% from the mean over the next 150 days the number of IED attacks in that area because it made it radically safer for the father to call in that tip. So that's a huge return on investment given the cost of a single IED attack in terms of vehicles and lives lost and whatnot. We saw this in many places. But local successes don't always accumulate. So this picture is from 2001. These are the kind of some of the first US Special Forces to go into Afghanistan, and they had like wild success, right? Kicked the Taliban out of the country in basically 4 months. Fast forward 9 years, things are not going well. Fast forward 3 more years, you're getting headlines like this in foreign policy. Fast forward 5 years, Ghazni is falling, and then Kabul falls again. So obviously the accumulation of those local successes did not get you the strategic outcome that you wanted. So what you lacked in Afghanistan, what the US never had there, was a theory for how you were going to connect the local successes that you could get to the strategic outcome that you wanted. And our science couldn't really provide that, right? What we could do is we could help you figure that out, but you needed a political theory. So I want to end with an example of where you had one and it worked. And that's Colombia. The story I'm going to tell you of the war in Colombia is really a strategic outcome that was good, that ran through 15 years of tactical success. So it goes back to 1998, and there's this theory that negotiations with the FARC will work, and so the Colombian government gives them a demilitarized zone where they can govern for themselves. That creates space, time and space, for the FARC to begin to develop military capacity. And that's not great. The US wants to do something about that, but it can't get involved in a conflict in Latin America. So in 2001, the US introduces something called Plan Colombia, which was designed to help the Colombian government with counter-narcotics. Now, what Plan Colombia did, among other things, is it overcame a funding constraint for the Colombian government. They knew where the FARC were, but they had good intelligence, but they didn't have the mobility to get out and go target them. And they couldn't get it funded by their government. So what Plan Colombia did is it provided basically helicopters and maintenance for the Colombian government to be able to get out into the countryside, use the information it had to target the FARC. And it's justified on the basis of counter-narcotics. So with Plan Colombia in place, the government of Colombia begins to put more pressure on the FARC. They don't like this. It's not favorable for them in bargaining. And so at President Uribe's inauguration in 2002, they dropped mortars into the city of Bogota from the hills right above the city. And I mean, you can go to Bogota and you can kind of see, like from the city, where these attacks were launched from. It's very close to the city. So clearly the security situation is not going well. So what happens? The Colombian government starts becoming more aggressive. Also, these right-wing paramilitaries begin acting. And the right-wing paramilitaries are extremely violent, and they're causing as much grievance as anything else. And so again, if you go back to that model of the father, right, when people in the countryside in Colombia had some information on the FARC, they had also a ton of grievances about the government because it was aligned with these paramilitaries. So 2005, the government finally figures out that this is a problem, and they demobilize the paramilitaries. So they remove that irritant from the situation. And they begin using the resources that they had, because they had those helicopters and that mobility, to push the FARC away from all the population centers. So you then begin to accumulate tactical successes. And then what's the link to the strategic outcome? Here, it's time. For the next 7 years, the conflict is more or less in a stasis. And the FARC are not able to target major population centers. The government of Colombia is able to keep them in the hinterlands. And that gets you to 2012, the beginning of peace negotiations with the FARC. From there, it's another 4 years until you ratify the deal with the FARC. And so the key idea here is that pushing the FARC out into the hinterlands, the government of Colombia never completely militarily defeated the FARC. They were able to sustain an insurgency in the rural areas. But over the course of those 11 years, between 2005, when the Colombian government demobilizes the right-wing paramilitaries, and 2016, when you finally ratify a deal, two things happened. The FARC leadership realized they weren't going to win militarily, and they got tired of being in the jungle. And the Colombian people were able to not be as angry about the things that the FARC had been doing in the late 1990s and 2000s, and so would vote for a political deal and let their congresspeople ratify a political deal that gave the FARC things that were completely unthinkable 6 years before. So the thing that you could measure and study with data, which was the tactical successes, led to the strategic outcome here through this theory of political change that is not at all testable with data. And so that's the last point, is as you're thinking about using data to understand conflict, you want to think theoretically about what's the connection between the things that we can measure and the outcomes that we care about. So for example, in the context of the talk Jim was giving earlier today, that might be that you can measure some things about population sentiment and will to resist, and how different countries think about their alliance commitments. But ultimately, how that all fits together into some overall deterrence picture, that's a theoretical question, not a data question. So these are the 3 points we talked about. As you're thinking about doing research on conflict, you should always be on the lookout for data that you can repurpose. And that's part of why fieldwork and data are complements, because oftentimes the data that you need you learn about in the course of doing field work. And I can talk about some specific examples of that. But even once you've done that, oftentimes the big picture things we really want to study that our partners in government are interested in are not things we can directly measure. And that's where we need theory and concepts of political change that are ultimately not testable, but give us that link function between what we can measure and understand and what we really want to get. Okay, I'll stop there and I'll go back and take some questions.
Right, thank you, Jay. And then I'm not going to exploit my role as a moderator, so I'm going to open the floor to questions. First, so anyone? Greg.
Thank you so much for this great talk. And so as you mentioned, sometimes we have the data that's there and then we want to repurpose it. So, but for someone doing survey experiment, for example, nowadays we are required to register a lot of things. So what's your opinion about it? It's like we want to explore something, but people may not want us to do so.
Oh yeah, so pre-registration is so the challenge you're identifying is it's hard to do discovery when you have to pre-register everything in advance. And I think the only way to handle that is to really work sequentially. And in subsequent pre-registrations, you just disclose what was unexpected that you learned in the previous round and what's new and how you're trying to fit it together. So, for example, in the case of the work that we were doing on Iraq, most things came together fairly well in the first round of work. And then the second round of work, we wanted to start to understand what was happening with the implementation of telecommunications infrastructure. And so this is a fieldwork and data or complement story, but also a response to your question. So I had an RA that wanted to learn Arabic and was working on his Arabic. This was 2010. And so I said, hey, why don't you call these Iraqi telecommunications companies and see if you can get some data on the rollout of the cell phone network, because we know that affects this primitive in the theory, the cost of sharing information and probability that you're retaliated against if you are the father sharing information. And so he managed to get a little bit of data from one company because the executive assistant to the CEO wanted to work on her English. And so the two of them struck up a correspondence, and we got some data for one company for a couple of years. And there were some initial results, and then I went to Afghanistan to do some work to help one of my co-authors who was running an internal think tank. So that would be like the equivalent of like the early survey experiment. Went there, and one of the questions at the time, this was early 2011, was whether the US government should subsidize the expansion of the cell phone network into rural Afghanistan. And there were two sides. One side said, this will be helpful because then people will be able to share tips and it will help the economy. And the other side said, we learned in Iraq that cell phones are a great way to fuse IEDs, and so we shouldn't support it. And oh, by the way, these companies are all corrupt and in bed with the Taliban, so we shouldn't do it. So I thought, okay, we have some very preliminary results from Iraq, but it's better than nothing. And we gave a briefing, and afterwards, a gentleman at the back of the room stands up and comes to talk to me afterwards and says, hey, my name's Lou. I work for Deloitte. I advised the Iraqi telcos on the build out of their cell phone network for many years. Who do you want to speak to? And Lou put me in touch with the CEOs of all the companies, and then we were able to get all the data on the expansion of the cell phone network in Iraq during the war. So in the context of pre-registration, at that point, we would have, if we were doing that now, we would have pre-registered our hypothesis about what we would see in the larger data and just acknowledged we did this early study which shows this, now we're scaling it up with new data, and here's why. So I think that's the best approach. But again, just a foot stomp, in that case, like being out in the field enabled that set of work and then a whole bunch more that other colleagues have done with data on the cellular communications network in Afghanistan as well.
Thank you for this fantastic talk. I have a couple of questions. The first one is related to the notion of theory building, because based on the talk, I can imagine that you probably don't just rely on deduct reasoning to build your theory. You could perhaps, the combination of deductive reasoning plus, inductive observations. And so maybe you can work through the usual theory building exercise that you usually, take. So that's the first question. The second question concerns the methodology that we can consider to use, or the type of method that we should train ourselves so that the tools will be at our disposal. So again, for your talk, I can imagine that, for example, the network analysis might come very handy because a lot of things that you mentioned actually, in my mind, concerns how the network actually works. So students, or I myself included, might need to learn how to run the network analysis. And Greg just mentioned the survey experiment, and I can also mention that you utilize a lot of larger scales in your research. So what are the tools that we should try to furnish ourselves with so that we can better do research on company? So 2 questions. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks, Ronan. So in terms of the process, the few times in my career I've had theoretical insights that I think were deep and original, they came from puzzling observations about the world that I wanted to understand. So the work on terrorism really started with the last job I had when I was in the Navy, which was doing some counterterrorism planning. This was shortly after 9/11. And the information that we were seeing on the groups that we were targeting was full of hate and disputation and internal arguments. And the story that we were being told about Al-Qaeda and other groups at the time is this was this unified, exceptionally dangerous ideological movement. And so I was like, these two things do not add up. There has to be something missing. And when I got to graduate school and I started studying organizational economics, it became clear to me that there was a language that would rationalize that puzzling observation. And then, was fortunate to be in a position to then get access to those different kinds of documents and resources that I showed you, where I could test that intuition. But it came from that observation about the world that was puzzling. And so as you think about process, that's often going to be your starting point, something that's weird. And you get that by going out into the field, or you get that by reading deeply in the history and subject matter of the thing you want to study. And maybe that triggers an observation about variance in the world, which is not well explained by the existing theories. And that's your point of entry. In terms of methodology, my advice to my students is always that you don't know what you're going to want to study, and you don't know what tools will be useful for that. So build as broad a set of skills as you can while you're in graduate school and your mind is more plastic and you have more time. So, I spent 4 years, and I was in grad school for 4 years. All 4 years, I was taking courses on statistics and econometrics and microtheory. There is no statistics in my PhD thesis other than some simple means. Right? Didn't use it at all in my PhD. But it turned out that for the next set of questions, which is the second part of the talk that I got interested in, it was hugely useful. And so that skill development created option value. And so if you think there are things you might want to use network analysis on in the future, but it's not part of what you're doing right now, that's fine, build the skill set, because chances are it will come along. So it's that sense of creating option value with it, not just solving the problems in front of you.
So speaking of methodology, I just have a quick question about methodology, probably as well as clarification. So I'm just wondering, how do you disentangle the relationship between the settlements of the civil infrastructure and more spending from the foreign government, USD? Did you solve the problem more with your anecdotes, your fieldwork, or is it more about statistical techniques? And the second question was, we're thinking about the Chinese case, where all of the localities all the cellular infrastructure is basically monitored by the government. So I was wondering, like, if I really want to apply your equilibrium in the Chinese context, what kind of suggestion you might give us? Thank you.
So thank you, and I'm not sure I understand the second question, so I might ask for a little clarification. But in terms of how do you think about the link between different kinds of spending and what we observe and how we decide what it means? What we did is we had this theory that we'd constructed which gave us a whole set of implications, both about the partial equilibrium relationship, the kind of general equilibrium relationship, and cross partials with respect to different things. So I'll make that very concrete. The theory gave us the expectation that in general, more aid would go to more difficult places because the local politics were worse, and that would lead to both investments by the government and higher levels of violence. That if you increase for exogenous reasons spending that was providing local incentives that were not accessible if the government didn't control the territory in the future, you should see reductions in violence. But things that would provide value regardless of who controlled the territory would not lead to reductions in violence. It also predicted that if you had more forces there, the violence reducing effect should be larger. And so there were all these different implications of our argument, and we just took each of them to the data, and as more and more observations both in Iraq and other countries started to show up that was consistent with not just one of those implications, but 2 or 3 or 4 of them, then we started to say, yes, that's the correct interpretation of the pattern. So it was triangulating across multiple studies was key. In terms of your second question, what is the outcome that you're thinking of?
I know this question is sort of out of blue, but I was thinking that, because I'm doing China studies, I'm sort of curious about the social protests, small social protests in China. I was wondering if the social protesters are wonderful players, but at the same time they're facing an environment where all the WeChat or like internet and even CCTV on the street was monitored by the government. What kind of scenario or equilibrium you may come up with?
If I were working on that, what I would look for would be the following. The first would be, there's a big body of research which suggests that the CCP as a strategy tolerates small amounts of local protest because it uses it to monitor bureaucrats and be able to punish the ones who are too corrupt or not doing a good job. So there's tolerance for a low level, and people know that. They're not unwilling to protest. They just know there's some level above which it will be a problem. So then the thing I would look for is things which affect the ability of the local bureaucrats to deliver services that are related to higher level bureaucratic functions like turnover, promotions, who supervisors are. And I'll give you an example of this from research on corruption in road building in India. So I had this project several years ago where we wanted to understand basically political influence over infrastructure projects in India. And we used an election discontinuity. So we looked at basically the share of contracts that went to people who shared the last name of the elected official of the district, of the local member of the state assembly, depending on only in close elections. So basically we looked at the shift up in the percent of contractors who share the last name of the person who barely won relative to the share of the person who barely lost. And we found that there's a substantial increase. That increase, it turns out, is much larger for people who are not in their last, for districts that were represented whose district collector, basically the local bureaucrat, was not in their last year in the district when they come under the most intense observation from other people in the Indian bureaucracy for promotion. So we have this year, they're there for 4 years. Years 1, 2, and 3, they don't believe they are closely scrutinized. Year 4, they do. And so what we would expect then is that in year 4, they would be really focused on performance and select the contractors that were the best and be more resistant to political corruption, which is in fact what we see in the data. So in the context of your question, there might be quirks of the bureaucracy in China, like the assignment of district collectors and when they get evaluated, that lead them to work harder in certain times and places than in others for reasons unrelated to local circumstances. And so I would use your knowledge and expertise on the bureaucracy to try and find those and then see if those quirks correlate with protests or not.
Can you hear my voice? All right. So thank you for your sharing. It's great. So I feel like sometimes the data just here, and so you maybe put it together and suddenly solve your problem. So I think if you want to solve lots of political issues, you need to have a very big database. But for example, like in some the terrorism countries, like Afghanistan, Pakistan, how do you make sure your data is authentic? How do you evaluate it?
So it's a great question, and I think you want to think about a couple things. One is, what are the incentives of the organization that's collecting the data? And then the second is, what are the quirks in the data? And for the second, field work, again, is a good complement. So the incentives of the collecting organization, in our case, and most of the data we've used are quite clear, which is they're collected by organizations administratively as part of their kind of audit and accountability and self-improvement processes. So the data on attacks that most militaries maintain is used for internal analysis to try and help them operate better. So they have reasons to try and make it accurate. Unit commanders might have incentives to fake it in some ways. But oftentimes those are trumped by higher level incentives. And so you can trust it for many things, not all things, but many things. So for example, you might not want to trust data for places where commanders are compensated on body count for the number of people involved in attacks, but the fact of an attack or not is probably unbiased. So you might want to know that. But so you think about those incentives, and then you want to understand when there were changes in the reporting criteria and how things get entered into a database, which you get by going out and talking to people. So for example, in our data from Iraq, there's a point in time when they changed the categorization of incidents with improvised explosive devices to break out ones that were attempted and failed from ones that were attempted. So if you just look at the time series, it looks like there's a big drop at this one point in time in the number of attacks with improvised explosive devices. In fact, that is a reporting artifact. That's the date when they changed and added this new category of failed attacks to the data. We figure that out because we noticed this change and we're talking to someone who's responsible for maintaining the database. And he was like, oh yeah, that's not a change. That's the date we did this thing. But we only knew that because we'd been out talking and working with the people who were there. So again, when you're working with these administrative data, just like getting out and working with the organizations that collect them is a critical part of the research process.
Okay, thank you for the excellent talk. Here, I think I have a question. Seems to me that you present the data collect from ongoing U.S. military interventions overseas, right? And that's the foundation of the whole research that you presented today, mostly about that. And the current world, I think, given the Trump administration is more reluctant to involve in overseas military interventions. So then the big question that comes to my mind is then how will this line of research evolve in the future? Thanks.
Yeah, so in fact, if you take that plot I started with, which shows interventions accumulating to 2005, there's a different data set that runs through 2022. And what you basically see is that the number peaks in 2008, and then it's flat for several years, and then it starts to come down. to the point where the last couple years the US is not actually involved in any major overseas interventions, and that might be expected to continue for some time. A couple things to highlight. One is there are many places where you can get very fine-grained data on conflict that don't involve the US being there. So there's press collected data. You can do collections, and then many governments do similar things themselves. So one of the things ESOC supported early in its history was an effort with the presidency's office in Mexico to take their internal data on the drug war and make it more systematic and get it out there for researchers. So there are lots of places you can do this. With respect to the relevance of this, every few years since really the end of the Cold War, there has been a major international intervention somewhere in a civil war. And so I don't think the relevance of this has gone away. And so at the moment, the African Union is involved in interventions in different places. There are potential interventions that could start in Latin America, as you have concerns about state collapse in a few places. So I don't think it's a problem that will go away. I mean, hopefully it will, and it would be great if this were all irrelevant for a few years. But it seems like it's likely to be an ongoing problem. In many places, the data derived off media reporting has proven to be very useful. It has certain biases, and in particular, it has there's been a lot of good work which shows that media reporting are heavily biased towards things that happen in larger cities, and also that they are heavily biased in terms of the scale that they report towards things that hit the kind of international news agenda. And one of my students, Andrew Shaver, has done a lot of great work on this. So you have to think about that and take that into account when you're doing the analysis. But the data are there for other places. They happen to be exceptionally good in these places because the US government is very good at counting things.
Thanks, Jake. I guess, thinking about the next agenda here, something we've talked about, but I think it might be useful to have you reflect on the group. What happens when we get to gray zone conflicts, kind of the proto, I guess something about it, certainly in this region, you have a lot of latent conflicts that are very troublesome in the sense that they can escalate into really big bad things. But the incidents that sort of track them on their own aren't the kinds of violent, casualty-causing incidents that we observed in some of these past conflicts. How do you think about those when we know that the lower intensity things tend to have more measured error? And what counts as the sort of incident of conflict? How do you think about that?
In these conflicts, I think there are a few things that research can do that's very helpful. One is you can think about actually accounting for and systematically checking how much is actually going on of your different gray zone activities. So a lot of the policy discourse around gray zone activities is based on the things that the concept that things happen at least once, and therefore they are a widespread thing. And that is often wrong. So for example, we're just wrapping up now a project where we went and looked at all the elections around the world in 2024 to see how many of them had influence operations by other states into the elections. So at the end of 2023, there was a ton of concern with influence in elections around the world, lots of arguments that democracy was at risk everywhere around the world, that Russia and China were going to try to move elections in all these different countries. And we've now almost finished looking at all of them. My recollection is there were 84, although that number is probably off a little bit. And less than a quarter showed any evidence of foreign influence operations. And so the idea that this was going to be a widespread thing, which was based on what had been happening up to that point in time, just turns out not to have been the case. But that act of just like counting systematically gray zone activities, I think, is extremely valuable and doesn't happen enough. Then when you get to what you can measure with them, Well, let's think about the idea that, for example, Chinese investment is winning at influence in countries around the world. Well, that might seem like a very hard question to study, because what is influence? Well, one way to study that is all politicians, not all, almost all politicians, almost everywhere, are out there making public statements almost all the time now on different social media platforms. That gives you like a real-time measure of how people are trying to communicate with their constituents. So what that means is you don't have a single question of like, is China winning influence in Indonesia by making investments? You have, 9,000 plus politicians who are on Facebook and Twitter and other platforms talking about political issues. And so you can do lots of things with that. So one thing we did with that is we collected the list of politicians' social media handles on Facebook and Twitter for all the members of the National Assembly of Indonesia and all the candidates that ran against them from 2010 through 2020. And then we looked at a set of foreign policy events where there was something that implicated Indonesian sovereignty relative to China in the South China Sea. So there were, I think, 3 major events. And for each one, we just asked a simple question, which is there a change in the social media activity of the politicians who live in who represent places that have seen significant Chinese investment relative to the ones who didn't? And the short answer is like, no, there wasn't one that we could detect. And in principle, it was a well-powered test. So we take that as evidence against the thesis that the investments were earning influence, at least with respect to how the politicians were talking to their constituents about conflicts with China. So what's the principle there is, as you think about these latent conflicts and gray zone competition, if you can break the mechanism of action that people worry about into these more discrete activities, lots of those are measurable. And then it's you have to think about what's your theory of how the gray zone conflict is playing out and then break it down into those concrete steps. Public opinion, social media activity, these are very concrete indicators. Others might be choices of commercial activity and who people transact with. You can multiply, but that's the basic principle.
Thanks for the enlightening and engaging presentation. Really, I'm Charles Tsai. I'm a student at the Taipei School of Economics. Brought back, took me on a trip through memory lane because I actually spent 2005 in Iraq for 3 months on a USAID contract. And as I was looking at your graph, the one on violence and USAID spending, I remember one conversation I had with our PR guy on the USAID contract. I actually worked on an FTO session for 3 months. And it was that he had an incredibly hard time getting any aid recipients to acknowledge USAID funding. In fact, to the extent that he did, he said that he always received pushback. And I asked him why, and what he told me was that the terrorists would actively target USAID projects, anti-PR, basically, for the USAID, to the extent that one of the people that he actually managed to convince to give credit was assassinated eventually. My question is, to what extent would that explain what appears to be increased violence accompanied by USAID funding in your graph?
So the strategic response could certainly explain some of it. What's interesting is that if you break USAID spending down into big projects and small projects, there is a kind of weak positive relationship for the big projects, but a clear negative relationship for the small projects in changes. So increases in spending on big projects correlate with a small increase in violence. Increases spending on small projects correlate with a decrease in violence, and one that's statistically clear. So that's consistent with earning small bits of goodwill helps you reduce violence, it's not consistent with the retaliation is the full dynamic. Because if the retaliation were the full dynamic, we should see it for both, right? So one of the interesting things this raises, though, is again the value of kind of field work and data as complements. Is oftentimes the things that might create bias in your data are not things you would be aware of unless you've gotten out there and either been in the place where the policy you're studying is going on, or spent a lot of time, an awful lot of time talking with the people who implemented it, who will be able to explain to you the bureaucratic policies and procedures that might lead to relationships in the data that are spurious, as in your example, the strategic response from the other side.
Thank you, Professor Shapiro, for your wonderful talk. So I also study terrorism, and the databases I use a lot, global terrorism database and the Iterate. But as far as I know, the information is mainly from media sources. And I have just heard you saying that if the information is from the media, it could be highly biased because of the report issue and because of their specific agenda. So I'm wondering whether you have any suggestions on how to deal with this issue. Thank you.
One of the questions that is always worth asking when you're doing this kind of work is the bias that I'm worried about correlated with whatever the treatment I'm studying is? And so I usually encourage people to not ask, is the data biased? Because the answer is like, yes, all data everywhere are biased. But can you tell a story for how the bias would be correlated with the thing you think is affecting the outcome? And oftentimes there, you can then start to think about tests for what you should see if the bias were correlated, with your treatment. And so that's kind of like the best you can do. Now on terrorism, if you're thinking about using GTD or Iterate, I infer you're probably thinking about looking at some of the cross-national patterns over time and space. One thing that has been very helpful for some of my students is when you think about a cross-national pattern, you then look for countries where you can either study it quantitatively or provide good qualitative evidence for the same mechanism that you've posited as being behind the cross-national pattern. And then that gives you greater confidence that the thing you found in the data is really about the mechanism you posited as opposed to some other thing. The other thing I would encourage is GTD, at least, is no longer being collected. And so if there were ways to support that, that would be a wonderful thing for the community if someone were to continue that data collection. For those of you who aren't aware of this story, there was actually an academic hostile takeover of that data set. There was a grant that had been going to one place, and a new organization with connections to the grantors kind of seized those resources and had it move somewhere else. And they were able to continue it, but it's a very weird story.
So I had a question more related to USA. Mm-hmm. So you have this research on how investing in the aid and its direction impact on conflict. And recently we know that USA was suddenly suspended in many places. It might be interesting another direction to look at what is the impact on conflict when we remove this aid. But then it's kind of I'm not so sure whether there's a reliable geocoded data to look at these kind of patterns subnationally. I know some people try to look into the description and then to use natural language processing to see what are these location distributed. But often these aids, if it is related to government specific, it's just that it's in the capital. So just based on your experience with the related data, how confident can we be to find these geocoded subnational data on aid?
So there are others in the room who've also had experience with USAID data. So I'll look to them also to weigh in on this. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. But what I'll say is there are the quality of data at USAID varies dramatically by project. And oftentimes, it really depends on how the project, in its initial conceptualization, wanted to track, and then what was negotiated with the contractors that were implementing it. And so it's highly variable. So for your question, I think probably the best thing that you will be able to do is some kind of interrupted time series analysis to look across multiple countries at the trends in where there was active USAID involvement, at the trends in conflict until this recent cutoff, and then look and see if there's systematically a big break from those trends in many countries. One of the early projects that my group wanted to do in Colombia, this was back in 2011 to 13, is we wanted to match up spending from kind of 2005 when the paramilitaries were demobilized through 2010 with trends in conflict and with surveys that we were doing. And we went to the main contractor that was doing work for USAID. And we wanted to do this analysis at the municipality level. We knew most of their projects were small and at the municipality level. But we went to them, and in their data systems, they had only recorded what was done over year periods of time, not within year. And at the level of a department, which was an administrative boundary that wasn't even actively used at that time, but that was what they had negotiated when they set up the contract. So there wasn't anything other than they just felt like that was the right level to record data. They negotiated that at one point in time. So when we came in later, the information was just no longer available, even if they had wanted to share it. And they did, it just didn't exist. So for USAID contracts, the availability of subnational data, even for things that have that characteristic, is highly variable across conflicts. And USAID had a large data collection and analytics operation, and I don't know what has happened to that information since recent events.
Yeah, I think because I look into a bit of the data, and like on the finance, like there's a website that just reports all the aids that I have distributed, and then there are other aid associations that requires everyone to report, or like OECD, they have this credit reporting system. Technically, if any country that disperses an aid to another country, they need to report that. But yeah, indeed, I guess for this subnational data, maybe to analyze such a question, it's better to focus on the specific countries that would have really a good idea about what the context is and what type of project they are to like analyze the subnational pattern. Yeah. Thank you.
I mean, I can comment on that since Jake was after me too. I would just say a couple things to add to that conversation. One is, it depends on the type of project. So some projects really are like located in a specific location. So like if you build a school, the school is in one location. A lot of times you can geolocate it. And then whether it's USAID or another donor, usually there's enough information that eventually if you get the documents, you can figure out where it is. But they also spend a lot of money on quite diffuse things. So if you do a training, all the people that attended that training, go back to their hometowns and they're sort of spread around the country. Or if you are doing budget support for a government ministry, a government ministry works in many different places, right? So at least in my experience, if you can focus on infrastructure, those are often much easier to pinpoint, or health sector where there are like specific delivery points or humanitarian aid. There is a correlation, I would say, between the overall quality of data that a USAID project would have and some of these contextual factors that Jake mentioned, in the sense that when you had monitoring and evaluation officers that really wanted good M&E, you would often get better records, right? So it's like both the data being collected and the kind of information about where it was taking place, I would say the quality is correlated, right? So in some ways, the tricky part is that projects where, frankly, the record keeping on where things were happening is a bit shoddy, probably also the data that they're collecting is what China too. So that's something to keep in mind.
Thank you for
So I would add one other thing on this, which is for those who are interested in studying the effect of governance reforms and government programs, I can't overemphasize enough the value of getting in early and identifying areas of mutual concern, because that can sometimes allow you to tap programmatic funds for measurement. So like the best field project I'll probably ever do is one that we ran in Pakistan from 2010 to 2015. And it was not on conflict things at all. It was on like vocational training and how you help women overcome barriers to accessing training in this highly gender unequal society. The implementing partner, the implementing organization in the Pakistani government, and the donor, UK's then Department of Foreign and International Development, now FCDO, were very concerned about gender equity in training. And so they were extremely concerned with the things that we wanted to study. And so we could get a really large amount of money for measurement and build into the program, because they were uncertain about how to make it work, a range of program variants that let us study the underlying social phenomena with tremendous granularity. And the key to that was identifying that shared interest early in the program design. Now, the one we did that on was actually the third program with that agency that we had worked on. And there were 2 years of working on other programs before that. But the being out there and engaged with them created the mechanism early in the design of that final program to build out a really spectacular impact evaluation. And so, again, there's just like huge value in getting out into the field and engaging with these organizations.
Hi, Professor Shapiro, and thank you. I'm Shen from Academia Sinica. So I have a quick question about theory building. I think one of the key messages that I received from your talk is that when we are studying conflict, we should not ignore, regional heterogeneity. Like Afghanistan, different villages, they might have different situations, right? So this comes to my question, so when we are developing our research ideas, so what we learn is that we always start with general theory, right? And then it becomes our research hypothesis, and then we collect data to verify our theory, right? So my question comes to according to your experience, how to strike a balance between theory, parsimony, and exploring different regional or local differences. So are we supposed to do that, expand our research hypothesis to exclude or explain those regional differences after we get the data, after we get the results? Or I just want to know what's your take on that? Thank you.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So oftentimes your general theory will have in it parameters that vary regionally. And so that's your starting point, is you build your general theory with the kind of, striking that balance between complexity and parsimony. But if your theory has in it parameters that vary either regionally or across subpopulations, that's useful in two different ways. One is it helps you explain more of the variation in the world, but the other is it gives you more opportunities to falsify your theory. And so then you can look for heterogeneity across different places or different responses in different places in ways that are very helpful. So I think that's the key, and oftentimes that will come about naturally because as you're thinking about the theory, it's very hard to come up with a theory that's applicable to all places if you know anything about the process at all. And this has analogs in other areas. If you think about theories about internal processes in organizations, we all know large organizations different than small ones, new organizations different than old ones, and so that should be in any good theory of behavior. Similarly with different regions, cultural backgrounds, there's lots of opportunities to do this. But that, again, gives you more opportunities to test the theory.
I guess now let me allow myself to ask a question. And it so happens that actually this question is very related to Shan's question. So, because you mentioned theory building, that kind of brought back my memory of having this weekly meeting with Bob Bates in his office at CID in my second year of PhD, I think, graduate school. And then back then they were just, I think they just published this book, Analytic Narratives. Remember that book?
Yep.
With a bunch of Stanford people like Barry Weingast and F.A. Grave. So I think back then the idea about this, relationship between theory and data is that, okay, you have formal models creating predictions, right? And then you also check your narratives, depending on which country you're studying, right? And then if you, after you go back and forth, and if you find there are some flaws or some, discrepancies between theory and data, then you come back to fix your theories. So there's this kind of virtuous cycle between theory and narratives. And I guess back then they also try to find, make a case for country case studies, I guess. So, but I would say back then the idea is that, well, if you have these country specific studies, then you can examine the mechanisms. And then that allows you to check if your predictions based on your theory might be right or wrong. Or as you just said, you might want to add new parameters into your model to make your model a bit more capable of dealing with those heterogeneities across different regions. But I wonder, that was published, I remember, 2000, so like 2 decades after now. So it seems that this kind of discussion is less frequent. I haven't heard about this kind of discussion that much. And now we have lots of new skills in empirical studies and data collection techniques, I suppose. But what do you think for the future? What kind of new discussion do you think might arise, given our new avenues for empirical research? And also, I guess, a lot of things that we do now on the empirical side, sometimes the models are really reduced. So they're reduced form models, and therefore, somehow we of course cannot have like those mechanism-specific stories, just like those country studies can offer. So I was just wondering, what's your take on this?
So I want to say to note that there is a big macro trend in research in political science and economics is that the share of theory papers has been steadily declining, and the share of kind of barefoot empiricist papers has been increasing. And that's just I think a feature of the world where more and more data are available, and where also some of the core parameters seem to be changing quite quickly. So where do you need theory? Well, you need theory, I think, most when you want to predict what will happen as the result of some policy change or advocate for some policy change, because you need to be able to say, how would the world look different if you did X than if you did Y? And oftentimes a lot of the studies that are beginning to fill in are studies that are answering questions about the relationship between a couple of variables in relatively atheoretical ways. And those kinds of papers are like very satisfying to write because you are interested in a relationship, you get the data, you check it, it is either one way or another, and then you're done. So you can see why there's more and more of that. But it leaves out a lot of really interesting questions. And I think one of the things that's happening now is we've gone like a little too far in that direction. And I see this in my graduate students. They actually have a very hard time coming up with arguments about why things will happen, and then turning those into tractable research designs. So how do you address that? How do you solve that? I think part of the answer is you go back and you read more of those kind of analytical books for inspiration and to begin to see how did people look at a fact pattern and come up with a theory that they could then take to other data to test it. And that's just like I think a skill people have to consciously push themselves to do, because all the temptations with all the information that's out there is to just dig in and do the barefoot empiricism. So that's like a total non-answer, except to say like, be disciplined and read history and analytical narratives. But you're very accurately describing a set of trends. One thing I would say is for some of the issues that we talked about regarding like, gray zone confluent and influence, the theoretical thinking is really terrible and could be dramatically improved. And I'll give you one very concrete example. The United States and Japan have been providing development assistance and foreign direct investment in countries around the world, but particularly in Southeast Asia, for decades. There's a lot of concern among some that China, which has been doing that for a much shorter period of time, is earning a ton of political influence by making those investments. That belief that political influence is durable is inconsistent with the belief that political influence exists in the first place. Because if it were durable, then the earlier investments by the US and Japan should have been durable. And therefore it should not exist. But if it exists, that is proof that the investments are not durable. And therefore it's less of a thing to be concerned about. But that even very simple level of theorizing about how these investments might win influence has not really been formalized well. And there are other mechanisms by which you could think it's earning influence that also haven't been formalized well. So there's a ton of work to be done there that could then be taken to tons of data on corporate activities, corporate statements, politicians' activities, politician statements, bilateral investment flows. Like there's a huge body of work to be done there. But the core theorizing hasn't happened yet. So it's like right there for people to do. And to my point, you need to have subject matter knowledge and local expertise to really figure that out. Like, that is a thing people in this room and at universities in the region can and should be doing.
So in that sense, do you think we should change the title of the conference to Empirical and Theoretical Studies in Conference?
EITM, yeah, so I will say the organization started at a point in time when we needed to move the field towards empirics. We will take to the directors the suggestion for rebranding.
Yeah, I think it's a great note to end the talk today. Yeah, thank you for coming to Jake's talk. Let's thank Jake again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.